Coming up on Talk Gnosis, Theurgy. Does it have to do with metals? Hi, welcome to Talk Gnosis for November 27th, 2013. I'm Bishop Kenneth Canterbury, and joining me as usual is my lovely co-host, Bishop Lainey Peterson. How are you this evening, Lainey?
I'm doing great. How are you, Bishop Ken?
Good. Excited. We've got a fun guest tonight and an interesting topic. You want to introduce our guest, and we'll start.
Okay, well, our guest this evening is Brother Michael Strojan. Brother Strojan lives out in Seattle, I believe. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's correct. And he is going to be talking with us tonight about Christian theurgy, something that he himself practices. So we're just going to get started here. Brother Michael, can you kind of define theurgy for us?
Well, the definition of theurgy is kind of an interesting endeavor. If we really want to go to the classical definition, theurgy essentially means God working. It is said to be the companion and completion of theology, basically talking about the gods. This definitely blends in really well with Gnosticism as an experiential belief system. So, the interesting thing about theurgy, though, is that when most people hear about it in our day, we think about, well, ceremonial magic, which, for the purposes of discussion, will actually be avoided this evening. Although, we will reference one of my favorite authors, Henry Cornelius Agrippa, because it's due to his work that we have a lot of the materials in our common age.
Okay. Now, your practice of theurgy, you said you don't want to talk about ceremonial magic, but so how do you incorporate Christian theurgy in your path and in your daily practice?
Well, so theurgy in my daily practice would actually be very comparable to a form of energized prayer. In Iamblichus, who was one of the early theurgists of the ancient world, he talks about the invocation of divine powers. Part of this is brought about through contemplation, sacrifice, prayer, and so forth. In a previous episode of Gnostic NYC on Gnostic practices, it was brought up, how many Gnostics do daily adorations and so forth. And those are, in fact, a theurgic operation aimed at uplifting the mind toward the Godhead, or however you want to put it.
Okay.
How I go about it, personally, is I start with a basic prayer. You might all recognize it. It's the Our Father.
Okay.
And I start by initially contemplating each and every line of that prayer. And what I find that to do is bring me up to a closer contemplation of Godhead until the point where I'm actually able to exalt my consciousness and be receptive and open up to the divine presence in my life. One of the interesting things about theurgy as such is in the Christian context, you find a very beautiful illustration of it in the process of iconography. A very popular iconographer, Russian, I believe, whose name I can't remember at the moment, sadly. He came up with a beautiful concept of how the body, the soul, and the spirit interact by way of illustration on the cross. It starts at a 12-step level, no joke intended, where you kind of start with what he calls atheismos, quite literally without God. For those of us who come from a Martinist tradition, we understand that, we're kind of stuck here at the bottom for the time being. You start out with a personality that's pretty much ruled by the passions and whatnot. But then you start understanding that, there might be something else there. And that stage of the body is logismos, which could be translated as word, but in this context, I believe it's much more closer to action in the sense of verb. Then through contemplating these mysteries, you end up with philosophia, which we start getting into theology and so forth, where we start opening our mind and asking what's going on here. For those of us who are familiar with the excerptex, the audito, where we're coming, where we're going, what life is, what rebirth is, and so forth. And it's from this step that we kind of reach a crux, which in some Rosicrucian systems that tend to use the Tree of Life as a model, for purposes of discussion, we might even say the Golden Dawn system of the degree at which one is introduced at Tiphareth. You end up bridging the gap between mythos, quite literally the narrative of religion, and then you start stepping into symbolos, the symbol. This is where a lot of people tend to start associating theurgy with magic, because magic in and of itself as a practice tends to utilize various symbolic images and forms. But in the context of theurgy, you tend to start looking at what lies beyond these forms. So in this soulful level, this middle stage, we encounter the eidos, E-I-D-O-S, which effectively means image. The word itself actually has much to do with the term icon itself, the idea. We all, in our physical bodies, you know, as Scripture says, are made in the image and likeness of God. But we're also physical, so we're naturally limited to being imperfect images that have the ability to stretch beyond that limitation. And from there, we end up at the logos, which is different from logismos at the bottom, where we actually start to see God face to face. This is a concept that you find in many mystical traditions. For example, the Passion of Saint Teresa is probably the most poignant that comes to mind, but you also see it with Hildegard of Bingen and various other Christian mystics.
Bishop Count, do you want to ask your questions?
Absolutely. You know, coming from my background, you know, being involved in Gnosticism, Artanism, and many things kind of related to the French Gnostic traditions, you know, our theurgical practices were, I guess, what many would label kind of as ceremonial magic in many ways, which is a topic we're not going to talk about much. But we had certain prerequisites for these. You know, we generally set up a sacred space. We generally set up an altar. We set up a gospel, open up to St. John. We set up a cross. We set up a candle as a symbol of the divine light. You know, many of the prayers that we use were very specific psalms. And psalms were very, very, very really important in many of these traditions. Your thoughts on kind of using psalms as part of your even daily practices, or as part of, I guess, kind of the general content of theurgy?
Oh, absolutely. I use psalms on a daily basis. Well, in fact, at least 3 times daily. I'm a very big fan of using the divine office as a form of energized prayer that also leads to a greater meditative state. It's interesting that you bring up the use of symbols. Porphyry, a 4th century Neoplatonist and also theurgist, writes in his text on the Pythagoreans of the use of music and contemplation and rhythms as a form of generating a atmosphere conducive to exalting the consciousness. For those of us who have a background in ecclesiastical worship, the Psalms are effectively songs. They were designed to be sung. And when sung as such, because I come from a Western background, naturally, I don't know the tonality of, you know, 1st century Psalms, nor do I really even recite it in Hebrew. That's not a language I'm all that well at. But because I do have a background in polyphony, I tend to opt towards that, using a form of polyphony that would have been very common in the Middle Ages, and sometimes I'll even sing them in Latin, but thanks to Pope Gregory, we have a lot of very beautiful sets to use with the Psalms accompanied to music, so that's what I tend toward.
I do have a question, Brother Michael, and this is not to be taken as a hostile question, but just one of concern. When we talk about symbols and using these symbols to create an exalted, or to bring oneself into an exalted state of consciousness, how do you distinguish between a genuine encounter with the divine and self-deception?
Well, that's the beautiful thing. So one of my various backgrounds as an esotericist, I started out actually as a member of Ordo Templi Orientis,
Okay.
And a student of Aleister Crowley, whose work I very much appreciate to this very day as a foundation of my further development. One of the things that was really impressed on me in my initial studies was keeping a journal or a record. And it's through that journal and record I can go back and say, well, am I BSing myself? What does this actually mean? Are there any things that I could actually use to compare or contrast? As St. Paul says in, I believe, Romans, test the spirits.
Yeah.
And that's something that I take very much to heart. And in fact, I believe it's something that Crowley himself wrote in his Magic Without Tears when he was responding to a pen pal of his.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to be among many spiritual leaders there is this notion of testing the spirits. Even G.I. Gurdjieff said, verify. Verify everything. Don't take anything that I'm telling you on faith. You have to verify. And if you can't verify, you just don't accept it. Which I think may be a hallmark of somebody who is, or one of the hallmarks of somebody who is a genuine spiritual teacher, is the willingness to say, don't trust me on everything that I'm saying.
Yes, exactly. And I've been fortunate to have many wonderful teachers who have said exactly that. So
Sure.
It's made an impression on me.
Good.
Well, again, just coming from my own traditions, many of the operations are, I guess, very Rosicrucian in nature, meaning that their purpose is meant for healing. We generally have operations of exorcism and operations of healing, and they can be direct healing applications. They can be loading of talismanic sigils or various other devices, healing cloths. But in almost all cases, when they're being used for others, they are used primarily for that method, for healing. In your own practice, do you find that you use these theurgical operations for healing, or for yourself, do you see it more of kind of for your own attainment, for your own inner uplifting, for your really kind of building that ladder to the divine?
Well, it's actually very fascinating that you bring that topic up. As I said before, I was not going to talk too much about magic as such in the context of theurgy. But because this is appropriate, one of the things that I would like to bring up is the semantic shift that occurred roughly around the Renaissance. So when the theurgists were writing around the 3rd century, you basically have 3 operations of spirituality, effectively. What you're talking about would properly be called thaumaturgy, which is miracle working. One of the fascinating things you'll notice, in fact, in Greek iconography, as well as a lot of the hagiographies, is that many of these great saints, the first one that comes to mind, in fact, is Saint Nicholas, is that in many cases they're called thaumaturges, which in most modern English translations of icon books, basically they say miracle worker. But it goes to a very similar thing. These people, in the context of their orthodoxy, they believe that the closest you can get to Godhead is theosis, effectively imitation of Christ or imitation of God, however you want to phrase it. But the hallmark difference between theurgy and orthodoxy is that the theurgists tend to believe, and I myself subscribe to this, is that not only can you try to imitate God, which I think is a great step, everyone should try it, but one can also unite with Godhead at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in the language of the theurgists, would have been called Gnosis.
Okay.
Interesting.
Now, Brother Strojan, if somebody wanted to learn about how to practice or how to get onto this path of spiritual purification and union, are there some resources that you would recommend? You recommend only personal instruction if it's available, or are there books or websites people can use to start?
Yes, in fact, there are a lot of great places to start. That's the beauty of theurgy as it's come to the modern age. First, for a context and background, because for me, context is everything, I would highly suggest reading the book Theurgy and the Soul. I forget the name of the author at present, but it is a beautiful text. It's pretty dry, but it'll give you a good idea of what theurgy would have looked like back in the early Common Era. Especially under Iamblichus. Fortunately, in the internet age, many of the great theurgical texts are available online. Esoteric Archives, I believe, hosts a great copy of Iamblichus's On the Egyptian Mysteries.
Okay.
I would also suggest, for anyone actually interested in looking how to apply this magically, whether they have a Orthodox or heterodox spiritual background in Christianity, there is no better place to go than the Philokalia, the writings of the early Church Fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And for those interested from a Gnostic perspective, we have a lot of practices available that are available on gnosis.org, but you can also find it in any solid copy of the Nag Hammadi library. I would definitely suggest looking at most of the Bruce Codex manuscripts, which tend to be very, very... Many modern Gnostics tend to consider them magical because of the use of crazy vowels and whatnot, vocis magicae. But that itself is actually one thing that can help set the tone for that exaltation of consciousness. There's also a great text, I forget where, but it concerns Marcus the Magician, who was a Valentinian, and he discusses the body of truth, which is a very, very profound practice that I've taken up, and I found it to be very, very advantageous for my own spiritual development. Other than that, there's a lot of available materials of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin online that are free available. I would definitely suggest reading his Theosophical Correspondences, as that kind of gives you an idea of a dialogue between a practitioner and someone else who is kind of in the know. And it's probably one of the best modern texts I can suggest. Yes.
Interesting.
Well, it's been wonderful having you on the show. We do have to start wrapping up the show. Can you tell us, Brother Michael, how can people get a hold of you online if they're interested in reading some of your writings? And
yes, people can contact me largely via my blog, which is at Michael, Michael, Seb, S-E-B, Lux, Lux, .wordpress.com, I believe, .org, something.
Okay.
I haven't been writing there very frequently as I've been working on some church-related stuff, seminary. But I do tend to post at least quarterly, so they can contact me there or on Facebook.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time out right now before the holidays get started. So thank you so much for being on our show.
You're welcome, and happy holidays.
Thank you. And I just want to mention to all of our viewers, make sure that you leave comments for us on YouTube. It's also important that, touch bases with us on Facebook. We do have our Facebook page. Look for Talk Gnosis on Facebook. Leave us comments. We will try to get back to you in a timely manner. Also, make sure that if you do have questions, one of the best ways is just directly through email, talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com. Again, thank you, Michael, for coming on here.
Yes.
Lainey?
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody once again, and this has been a production of the Gnostic NYC Network. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends, click the like button, and subscribe to our channel. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the views of Gnostic NYC or any other organization. No animals were harmed during the production of this show. For more Talk Gnosis, tune in every Wednesday for new episodes. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Oh, we can move. Okay.